Things are moving quickly in the federal government. A lot of news has been focused on federal employees being fired. It's hard to keep up with. Let's talk about what has happened, what matters, and what we need to pay attention to going forward. Welcome to the American Public Discourse. This is the official episode 1, and I'm excited to be here with everyone listening. And please, if any real musician out there wants to send me a better intro, I need it. I came up with that one on GarageBand on my iPhone, and I'm not very happy with it. Today, we are talking about the Trump administration firing federal workers and consolidating the executive branch's power. As always, I want your input. I'm going to be introducing these topics today, but send me an email or send in voice memos to let me know how these things have impacted you and your community. The point of this project is to connect varied people and break out of our isolated little bubbles. So tell me about your experiences. Even if you have not been strongly impacted, share your thoughts. This isn't a test. Then, the next time I bring this topic up, I will be sharing your responses, listening, and responding. I'm not going to be judgmental. Don't worry. I just want to hear from you. If you respond, I'm asking for 3 things. 1, your response. 2, tell me whether you want to remain anonymous. It's totally fine either way. I'm remaining anonymous for now myself. And 3, tell me one thing about you that has nothing to do with your opinion. Maybe you have kids. Maybe you have a dog. Maybe you have a fear of dogs. Maybe you're watching a really good TV show that you recommend. Just give me one thing about you that is not a political opinion. Responses can be sent to AmericanPublicDiscourse@gmail.com. That is all one word, AmericanPublicDiscourse@gmail.com, and it should be in the description. Don't worry about being an expert or being qualified to talk about something. I'm not an expert. I'm not a reporter. I'm not really qualified to talk about this. The point of this project is to keep people connected and talking to each other. For my part, I'm going to be what I call radically honest. I'm trying to be really open and to really dive into the substance here without buzzwords, without assuming you've seen the same things I have. We're keeping it real. This is not about asking anyone to compromise their values, by the way. I just want us to stay connected. If you're someone who feels overwhelmed about everything happening right now and you don't know what matters and what doesn't, I will start that conversation a little later in this episode. At least as it relates to the firing of federal employees, that is. There's one caveat. In terms of the long-term consequences, ending functions performed by the departments will be more consequential than firing employees right now. But this episode is focused first on the overturn in the workforce, so maybe substantially shutting down aspects of different departments can be a future episode. By the way, people watching this on YouTube, instead of just a still image or filming myself talking, I uploaded some gameplay of a video game called the Sapling as the video. Those familiar with this may notice I forgot to turn on mutations. I do remember that later. I get there eventually. I just hadn't touched it in quite a while. Okay, so let's get to the topic. Facts first. What is happening? These are the facts I'm seeing and hearing about. And if you are seeing and hearing important things that I am missing, let me know. So, according to the Pew Research Center, as of November 2024, the federal government had over 3 million employees. Per the Pew Research Center, that is 1.87% of the entire U.S. civilian workforce. That 3 million figure does exclude active military, excludes congressional staffers, and excludes some other categories. Now, obviously, congressional staffers are not part of the executive branch. I am not sure from the article if it includes or excludes all legislative branch or judicial branch employees. Either way, I saw a separate article saying the federal workforce DOGE is dealing with is 2 million people. So we're looking at 2 to 3 million people, depending how you cut it. Also, it does look like USPS is a big part of that 0.6 million, so it's possible that the 2 million does not include USPS. Either way, it sounds like our ballpark figure for the executive branch is about 2 to 3 million, somewhere loosely around that scale. It's not one big group working together. Keep in mind, it's a ton of departments with different purposes and different tasks that they perform. I keep hearing that the salaries of employees make up less than 5% of the federal budget. So that's about $336 billion per year. That's according to an article I read quoting Don Kettle, a former university dean. It was a marketplace article by someone named Janet Nguyen. Sounds like that does not include the cost of things like giving them a desk and a computer to work at, but still good to remember that 5% number is a loose indicator of the budgetary impact. Either way, I've heard that 5% or 4% in a lot of different places recently. So what do we know about how many of those 2 or 3 million or so are getting fired? Well, as of that marketplace article I just referenced, which was from March 6th, they said more than 62,000. So, in terms of the individual people getting fired, quite a lot. If you're trying to think about percentage of the federal workforce, it's not gutted. Before I look into that 62,000 more detail, I want to say I'm going to start relying on an older article from February 26th. There was a New York Magazine article by Will Pyshell from February 26, but it did a good job breaking down which departments were losing how many employees each. At that point, in February 26, only 30,000 had been fired. So, as you can imagine, it's a bit outdated, but it's just going to give us a starting point. By the way, I never read New York Magazine much, so let me know if it's a source you recommend. It was just one of the first things that popped up with the total sum of employees fired and breaking it down by department. So, according to this article, the Department of Agriculture lost 4,200 employees, the majority from the Forest Service. If you've been to any national parks recently, send me an email or a voice memo about your experience, whether you saw an impact or not at all. Let us know. Again, this project is about trying to connect people to talk about our real experiences, with it being very easy for you to submit comments, and I just want to make it easy. I'm not going to cherry pick responses to fit a narrative. The world is messy. Okay, so Forest Service, that's part of the Department of Agriculture, also known as USDA. I can tell you right now that is already a very outdated number. We'll get to that later. So the Department of Health and Human Services lost 2,800 employees. By the way, a lot of these are probationary employees. Whenever we see the term probationary employee, that does not mean in the federal government what it means to normal people. Most of the cuts I saw were to probationary employees. Of course, it's a special term in the federal government, right? Because nothing can be normal. It usually means just that someone is newer to a job, including if they were recently promoted. It doesn't necessarily mean they did a bad job and were put on probation the way most of us would think about it. All right, so the Department of the Interior lost 2,300. At Veterans Affairs, 2,400 were fired, including medical professionals. I will say, if you have ever met VA doctors and nurses, that is not an easy job. They have locations across the country, so I do wonder how well spread out the cuts were to not impact one location too hard or too quickly. I do not know the answer to that. If you have recent experience at the VA, let me know. All of these were probationary employees too, so lots of new hires. Homeland Security lost 400 people. That includes FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. 400 people at the Department of Transportation. According to this article, no air traffic controllers were fired, which I must say, I was given the wrong impression on that. But according to this, nope, no air traffic controllers have been fired. Again, that was at least as of February 26th. All right, I'm not going to do all these departments, but one last really big one is the Department of State, which had 10,000 people from the U.S. Agency for International Development, also known as USAID, who were fired. We've probably all heard of USAID in the news recently. Quick note about money sitting frozen at USAID. Money is approved by Congress for spending on certain things, right? Congress generally has the power to approve spending, not the president. Yes, I'm oversimplifying. And of course, Congress includes in the budget some discretionary money. But USAID has frozen some money approved by Congress, approved for specific things, and it is now sitting there. With a lot of USAID being gutted, we have to keep track, as voters and taxpayers, of where that money goes. If you want, we can talk on another episode about congressional spending and the executive branch's ability or inability to withhold that aid. And there are things the executive branch can do to stop spending that Congress has approved, but they have to go back to Congress. More recently, the executive branch has asked employees to actually return to work, some of the employees that they've let go. The one I keep hearing about is employees at USDA, that's the Department of Agriculture, that were working on the bird flu outbreak currently happening. Apparently, some people were accidentally fired in these mass purges that were working on fixing the bird flu situation. The government went, oops. In fact, one of the research facilities was partially shut down because so many people were fired, and now they are struggling to get people back that they decided they, in fact, do need. The Department of Energy is also rehiring folks, or trying to. About 30 people who build and maintain power lines were fired, and now Energy is trying to rehire them. Meanwhile, the Department of Labor also recently is rehiring 120 people who were placed on leave. The Department of Labor, as far as I saw, hasn't said why, but it sounds like there is a strong chance they believe the hirings won't hold up legally. But who knows? They haven't directly admitted or said that that is why. Some of the fired federal employees and officials have sued, saying they were fired illegally. There was a chairwoman of the Merit Systems Protection Board that sued to get her job back. What is the Merit Systems Protection Board? Basically, they rule on employment issues in the federal government. They were created by Congress, which of course has the power to create laws about how the government works. There's a history there about some problems we used to have that prompted Congress to create this board, but that's a whole other conversation. Of course, when you talk about firing employees, the board is going to be one of the first things you face if you did anything wrong as the government. Now, the government fired one of the chairs. Right now, there were only 2 chairs when there's supposed to be 3, so already we were down 1. This firing would have brought it down to just 1 filled and 2 vacancies, so the board would really be unable to do much. Once appointed, the chairs are supposed to serve for 7 years, and they cannot be removed, at least by the law Congress passed, cannot be removed except for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance. The fired chairwoman sued, and a judge ruled that because she was not fired for any of these 3 reasons, she could not be removed. I'm sure the government will appeal that if they have not already, but for now she is back. Another higher-up that was fired was Hampton Dellinger. He was the head of the Office of Special Counsel. Same as the Merit Systems Protection Board, he can only be fired for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance. Dellinger sued. The government argued that the requirement is unconstitutional. That being, the federal government is arguing that the requirement that they can only fire him for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance is unconstitutional. The lower court ruled for Dellinger, same as they had done for that chairwoman of the Merit Systems Protection Board, and the lower court said the government did not lawfully fire him, so he was back in his job. However, the government appealed, and the appellate court issued a short order putting that lower court order on hold, meaning Dellinger is fired until they decide the case. So now Dellinger is out. If we were going to get a final ruling from the appellate court, that would be really big. But we won't, because at that point, Dellinger just dropped the suit. So Dellinger is out permanently. Remember that Merit Systems Protection Board? Remember, it rules on employment issues, some employment issues in the federal government. Well, the board found that almost 6,000 people might have been fired illegally at the Department of Agriculture, USDA. That might be just a temporary return, but at this point, they have allowed all those people to return to work for 45 days until they sort things out in the case. You'll notice that happens in a lot of these cases where someone files, we don't get quite to trial or anything because cases take a long time. So early on in the case, these judges or this board are saying, okay, temporarily for now, based on what we have seen, here's how the judge thinks it's going to go. And if they think it'll probably go in favor of the employee, then they can put the firing on hold. There's a lot more to it than that, but so that's basically what's happening. Just while the case is ongoing, before we can get to a full discovery, trial, all that, putting a restraint on the federal government in the meantime, because the judge thinks the employee will probably win. And again, there is more to it than that, but I'm just not getting into all of the legal requirements right now. So specifically with the USDA, what the Merit System Protection Board was looking at for these 6,000 people was that they were all fired for poor performance. They all got an identical letter saying they were being fired for poor performance, but there was evidence allegedly showing that despite these 6,000 people being given letters saying they had poor performance, the government had not actually looked at their performance. Instead, they were allegedly fired because the government was shuffling people around for reorganization, which it can do, but if they do that, and if someone is fired for that reorganization, that person is supposed to be given 60 days notice. So that would have given the employee time to prepare and hopefully find another job. Also, look, if you're making a record that someone was fired for poor performance, you're just screwing them over, dude. All these people would have had a record of being fired this year for being bad at their job, even though it had nothing to do with performance, allegedly. That's just screwing people over for nothing. The government make it more efficient, but I'm really not a fan of the government lying, and this one is just particularly dirty and cruel. What did it accomplish? Now they have to rehire them for 45 days. So with the 60-day notice, which I'll admit is a damn generous notice, but with the 60-day notice, they saved a net of 15 days if the case goes the government's way. NPR, by the way, has done a lot of reporting on this specific case that I relied a lot on. So there's a lot more litigation going on right now, and I'm going to skip the rest of it. So more recently, Trump had a cabinet meeting where he told the heads of departments that only them and their departments can fire their own employees, not Elon Musk. Musk can just advise. If that was meant to be the case all along, I'm sure that was news to everyone that was fired by Doge without the heads of their departments having a say in it. By the way, I keep referencing Doge. Doge is the Department of Government Efficiency. It's a new rebranding, for lack of a better word, of an existing department. Musk's actions have largely been characterized as through Doge, characterized by Trump and Musk as through Doge and as him leading Doge. That's not so clear anymore. More recently, the government, in a case in court, the attorneys defending the government said that Elon Musk isn't actually part of Doge, but it sure as hell sounds like he is, de facto. So, nonetheless, what was going on in this cabinet meeting? All these departments were told, oh, actually, you guys make the decisions on firing, not Musk. I don't think this is understood as a rule that was supposed to be the case the whole time. Realistically, I think this is understood by Trump to be a change, because he posted on social media saying, now that we have my cabinet in place, I've instructed the secretaries and leadership to work with Doge on cost-cutting measures and staffing. The implication there is that before, he did not have his cabinet in place, and therefore there were different instructions. By the way, I was looking at an NPR article for the specific facts and direct quotes. They had a really good article that just had a lot of direct quotes. The article was titled, "Trump Says Cabinet Secretaries, Not Elon Musk, Are in Charge of Government Cuts" by Shannon Bond. Lots of quotes from Trump himself in there. Another quote, Trump said, "I don't want to see a big cut where a lot of good people are cut. I want the cabinet members to keep the good people." So, nothing wrong with that quote itself, but it does not feel like that's what's been happening. I mean, my dude, how do you fire 30,000 people in, I don't know, a month or so? Oh, actually 60-something thousand now, in a month or so, and not cut the good people? If that's their approach now, that's a major change, and that definitely was not what they were going for before. Trump also said, essentially he was saying that if the department heads don't cut enough, Musk will go back to doing the cutting. In context, that was cutting jobs. So it might go back to Doge or Elon Musk, we will see. Another more recent development. There were headlines recently saying that Trump is now requiring people who get temporary restraining orders against the government, including these fired workers, to post money bonds with the court first. Now, a temporary restraining order is sort of what we've been talking about with these temporary orders while the case is still going on. A temporary restraining order is a restraining order you can get fairly early on in a case. It doesn't have to be that early on, but you'll end up asking for it fairly early on in a case because you're saying that if the other side does what they're planning to do, there's no coming back from it. At least there's nothing the judge can order at the end of the case that will address the harm you're going to suffer if the other side does what they want to do now. To get a temporary restraining order, you have to meet a legal standard. And yes, I'm definitely oversimplifying things, but you ain't getting that order unless you can show that there's no way to fix what the other side is about to do if you wait till the end of the case. And you need to show that you'll probably win at the end of the case. Again, I'm oversimplifying and leaving a lot out. Before we get into the news, let me tell you right now that the impression I got from these headlines were misleading. At least what I assumed based on the headlines was not correct. And I don't think the headlines themselves did a very good job. These came in around March 6 and 7, and I didn't have a lot of time to really read what was going on. I was just seeing headlines as I was very busy. My incorrect initial impression was that Trump had somehow signed an executive order mandating new requirements for anyone getting a temporary restraining order against the government. That would be absurd. We have 3 branches of government, and no matter how you shake it, the executive branch cannot impose a new requirement on the people suing it. The judicial and the legislative branches would have some control over that. Their roles are a little different, but this is definitely not something an executive branch has the power to do. You know what these articles actually made me think of? Have you ever seen that video on the internet where a YouTuber was playing soccer and he got a yellow flag from a ref? So he pulled out an Uno reverse card on the ref. Yeah, like the card game Uno. From the impression I got from these articles, again, mostly just the headlines, I was thinking someone was being told that they have to post bond due to this new executive order. And I was thinking they should just pull out an Uno reverse card like, oh, you have a useless paper and so do I. What do we do now? Because an executive order saying that would be a useless piece of paper. Now, this impression given by the headlines was incorrect. No matter what you think of Trump and his administration morally, the people advising him on executive orders are not that dumb. So what really happened? There is an existing rule of federal procedure. Those are the rules established by the courts to govern the procedure of federal lawsuits. There's an existing rule that already can require posting a bond when seeking a temporary restraining order, sufficient to cover any damages suffered by the person restrained if it turns out the plaintiff was wrong. So when the court tells the government, in this case the government, it could be anyone, when the court tells the government not to do something, maybe it turns out the plaintiff was wrong. And actually the government did have the right to do that thing. And the government suffered a loss because they weren't allowed to do the thing, or they had to wait 3, 5, 10 months to do the thing. So the idea is the plaintiff was post a bond, and let's say the court thinks, well, the government might suffer $10,000 of losses, of damages. Well, we'll post a bond for $10,000. And if it turns out the plaintiff was wrong, the defendant, if they lose out $10,000 worth of damages, at least there's the bond to cover them. That's, again, as always, oversimplifying. By the way, for any lawyers out there listening to this that don't deal with much federal civil procedure but want to look up this rule, it's Rule 65C. And I will actually read us the rule. So, Rule 65C of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. Civil meaning it's not criminal cases. So C states, security. The court may issue a preliminary injunction or a temporary restraining order only if the movant, the person asking for it, gives security in an amount that the court considers proper to pay the cost and damages sustained by any party found to have been wrongfully enjoined or restrained. The United States, its officers, and its agencies are not required to give security. That last part is irrelevant here. That's saying if the United States is the one asking for the injunction, the temporary restraining order, that the United States does not have to pay that to give that bond. That's not relevant here because people are asking for the bond against the United States. So, even though the rule says you can only issue a temporary restraining order if the plaintiff posts that bond, courts still have to decide what is a proper amount. I'm not familiar with this rule and this procedure at all, by the way. So I was just skimming through some articles on the internet. There was a 1995 article titled security for interlocutory injunctions under Rule 65C, exceptions for the rule gone awry. It was written by someone who was a law student at the time, Aaron Connors Morton, and I'm sure that the fact that this article is 30 years old means it's very outdated, but I sort of ran out of time, so I'm doing what I can. Anyway, my quick and dirty impression from the skimming was that there are situations where the court deem a proper amount to be no bond. Again, right, the rule says the court determines how much. So it looks like how often the courts require the bond versus don't, what the exceptions are, varies from court to court. So Trump released a memo, not an executive order, a memo with a lot of talking points. A lot of it was just political talking points. But the substance is that Trump is telling agencies, and really lawyers, that unless there are extraordinary circumstances, the lawyers for the government should always be requesting that bond if someone's getting a temporary restraining order against the government. That's basically it. It's not nothing, right? Because it means every single Joe Schmo fired employee that can't afford it has to try to post a bond to get this temporary restraining order. So it's not nothing, but it's not creating a new rule in the procedure of the courts by the executive branch, which again would be absurd. If you want to know whether this is something to keep our eye on going forward in terms of the fired federal employees, not really right now, until it starts substantially preventing a lot of people from being able to get the relief they otherwise would have. So it'll come down to what the courts grant, not what the executive branch asks for. In other contexts outside of employment, yes, this could be a big difference. We'll have to see. There is one line in the memo I should mention. It says, federal courts should hold litigants accountable for their misrepresentations and ill-granted injunctions. The second half of that sentence is obviously just political talking points. After all, someone who gets the injunction already had enough to show the court that it was probably necessary. And if someone makes a misrepresentation in court, there can already be serious consequences for that. But the memo does not say the federal courts must do anything, just that they should. Nonetheless, if it had said they must do something, Uno reverse card. Maybe any time we see a useless piece of paper signed by someone with no actual authority to demand whatever it says, I'll just say we can Uno reverse card it. That'll just mean it's a useless piece of paper, as useless as pulling out an Uno reverse card. So if I pull out that reverse card, now we both have equally useless pieces of paper. Nonetheless, like I said, it says federal courts should. So whoever was writing it, understands. One aspect of firing federal workers we hear a lot of talk about is the number of individual federal workers fired and the real impact that it's having on their lives. Obviously, citizens don't have some general right to be employed by the federal government, but I don't want to ignore the tons of people losing their jobs very suddenly all at once. That's a lot of people now looking for new jobs. I don't know yet whether this will have an impact on the economy. The federal government released a new jobs report recently, but the data they looked at ended weeks ago, so that's not going to really capture a lot of this. Another concern with all these firings is that it's also an incredibly short amount of time to transition all of their knowledge to other employees. You figure it out eventually, but that's some unnecessary time and data loss. Some important tasks can theoretically be forgotten. It just gets inefficient. Anyway, now they're suddenly trying to rehire folks. So they did mess it up, and now they're like, oh darn, looks like we do need people to run those power lines after all, or fight that bird flu. Now, as much as people losing their jobs is very real, and having a very real impact on their lives, that's not really a long-term harm that we cannot recover from. Don't get me wrong, it can be a long-term harm that an individual employee and their families cannot recover from, but I want to transition to two things I'm worried about that might cause more long-term harm that the country as a whole might have a hard time recovering from. And just things that we need to keep our eye on. First, some of the very first employees to be fired were the very people responsible for monitoring the federal government for corruption. These are the inspector generals. Actually, I don't know if the plural of inspector general is inspectors general or inspector generals. Which word becomes the plural? Anyway, the inspector generals are really important because they are the ones who check for corruption in other parts of the federal government. And yeah, dude, I'm sure everyone can understand that we need to monitor the federal government for corruption. Two of the people fired were actually put in place by Trump himself in his first term. So these are not all inspector generals appointed by other presidents. 2 were appointed by him. Different departments will have their own inspector generals in that department monitoring it. So, for example, he fired the inspector general for the VA and at least 7 other agencies. I don't know if there have been more. One article said it was 12 inspector generals total. So how do you have someone who is part of the executive branch, who is supposed to monitor the executive branch, and not just have them fired right before the executive branch does something corrupt? Well, what Trump had to do was give Congress 30 days notice before firing the inspector generals. So at least that would have given Congress a little opportunity to just say, hey, do we think there's something here we need to worry about with the president firing the inspector general? Is he trying to pull something off? And Trump could have done that. He had just won. He had just gotten sworn in. He was more popular than ever. And he had his party in control of Congress. It would have been so easy, and Congress would not have cared. At least the Republicans controlling Congress would not have cared. But he just didn't do it. Now, in addition to the inspector generals, remember Hampton Dellinger, fired from the Office of Special Counsel? He was also one of the people responsible for fighting corruption and wrongdoing in the government, and now he is out permanently. They need to fill that role like yesterday. Someone needs to be doing that job. That person does things like make sure whistleblowers are protected. You want some people in the federal government who are going to call a spade when it comes to corruption and keep a close eye. So you do want people to have some protection or at least transparency when they get fired. Is there an argument that the president should have a little more control over the executive branch? Sure, there is. There are fair and good arguments on both sides of the issue when it comes to the independence of agencies. Sometimes Congress sets up agencies that are supposed to have some protection from the whims of the presidency. And there is actually some legitimate debate about how far that can go. But firing all the anti-corruption watchdogs at the same time, all of them, some of the first ones out, that's a whole other can of worms. More than anything else, this is what matters. We need trustworthy people in those roles now. Don't just leave them vacant. No one's filling those positions right now. I've searched, and I have not seen anything about new people being put in place to do that job. The inspector generals or head of the Office of Special Counsel to watch the federal government for corruption. That means not just at the top, and includes at the top, but not just at the top, includes watching each agency. You think the people at the top can monitor everything that's happening in the federal government? I know they're reducing it, but it's not being reduced that fast. The second, more long-term harm I'm worried about is gutting these systems to the point that they cannot carry out the functions Congress has demanded. Now, that's going to depend a bit department by department in terms of what are the actual programs that we might be worried cannot be carried out, and is it true, or were there way too many people in that department and more than they needed? Again, that's a bit beyond the scope of this episode. Any one department you want me to follow up on, let me know. But, and anything that you've seen, let us know. Again, send something, it can be anonymous if you want, and I'll read it or play it so that you can add your voice to the conversation. But if I'm looking at this overarchingly, one thing I'm worried about is separation of powers. So there's 3 branches of the government, right? We all know this: executive, judicial, legislative. We have to separate 2 different concepts here. One is the elected executive leader, the president, his control over the executive branch. Another concept is the executive branch trying to exert control over decisions that the other branches are supposed to make. So independent agencies, that's, like I said, that's one concern, but that's a separate concern. That might not be the thing to focus on right now. There's been a push and pull, like I said, for a long time about how much the Constitution allows for these independent agencies. And I get why people gravitate toward wanting a steady, independent agency for some functions. But while that's an important conversation, I think the more clear-cut one is that we should keep our eye on is destroying the mandates of Congress. So what do I mean by that? The legislative branch has the power to, do a hell of a lot, really. For a lot of these agencies, Congress passes a law saying the government has to do this thing. So what is my concern with separation of powers? Well, a lot of the work these agencies do is work that Congress passes laws saying they have to do. So Congress will have a bill saying the government needs to run this program, whatever. If you get these agencies too far and get to the point where you can't implement the programs that Congress demands you implement, then it becomes a separation of power issue, right? Because the executive doesn't have the power to ignore the laws that Congress passed. The president can veto a bill, but if they don't veto that bill becomes law, right? If it's passed by Congress, whatever. And if the presidency can get around that by just gutting an agency until it can't do its job anymore, and actually, going back a second, the president can veto a bill, and then Congress has a chance to pass it over the veto with a higher number of people voting for it, whatever. Anyway, once it's a law, if the executive branch can just get around that by saying, hey, we don't have the people to implement this thing that legally we have to because we fired everyone that Congress already decided to pay for the year, that's a huge separation of powers issue. So, I don't know. Do you think this could cause some damage to our separation of powers that we would have a hard time coming back from? Or is this more of a temporary thing and any separation of powers issues won't survive? Or maybe you think either way, it'll go to the courts. We'll figure it out in a fair, reasoned manner. Let me know what you think. Because I don't know how to feel about this issue. I feel like it's got the potential to wear down separation of powers, but on the other hand, are we there yet? Maybe not. It sort of depends where things go. Let's talk a bit about the reasons for going so fast. It's tough because to some extent you have different factions weaving through this administration that have different reasons and goals for whatever they do, but they'll all end up being okay with a certain result. So it kind of depends who you ask when you're asking why do people want this to go the way it's going. Also, I want to be transparent that more than any other part of this episode, I'm really guessing here. I'm trying to come up with reasons for going so fast, but there's not a lot to go on. So am I kind of pulling these out of nowhere? I mean, I'm trying not to, but yeah. So take this with a grain of salt. Challenge me. Let me know if you think I'm wrong. Also, if you think they're not moving fast enough, I really want to hear from you and hear why. A lot of people, I think, are surprised by the speed. And so all of the focus right now is it going too fast? Are things going too fast? Are people getting cut faster than we can know what's happening? Faster than the government can be transparent, or at least we can force them to be transparent, faster than the government can actually make good decisions here. That's sort of what I'm hearing a lot right now, because everybody's reacting to the change, right? The change is a speed up. So if you feel like you wish it had gone faster, tell me why. Add your voice to the conversation. I really want to know. It's just not the focus right now of what I'm hearing. Now, coming up to what are some possible reasons they're doing this? I was able to come up with 4 possible reasons for moving so fast, maybe 5. Reason 1 is to dramatically hamper these agencies faster than anyone can fix it. The administration knew they would be challenged in court. They probably knew that some of the employees would have strong cases. So did they fire people too quickly for anyone to have time to react? Maybe, quite possibly. But if so, that's really worrying in terms of the separation of powers issue we talked about. We have 3 branches, and they all check each other in case one runs amok. So this is like the executive branch saying, hey, Congress passed some laws about how the federal government can run, and we think Congress had the power to do that, and therefore we think we will lose in court if we are challenged, right? Because courts decide ultimately how to interpret the Constitution. And if they think that they're going to lose in court, that means that they think the law could be passed and Congress was right to pass it. So essentially they're saying, hey, we think Congress and the courts go against us. We think Congress did have the power to restrict our choices here. So let's make both Congress and the court useless by moving faster than they can possibly stop us. Which is especially silly because Trump could have gone to Congress and had them change any laws he didn't like about hiring and firing federal workers. You know how many members of Congress are desperate to kiss his ass right now? You've got them introducing legislation to put his face on money and a bunch of similar things. I know the less sycophantic GOP reps and senators might be less likely to chomp at the bit at every single thing he wants, but if he presents something that could sound reasonable, like, hey, it is way too hard to reduce the size of government because we've gone overboard with all these employment protections, I bet they'd pass that.
it's not like they're busy doing anything else. I mean, they're only working on the budget right now, which, don't get me wrong, the budget is big. It's usually the biggest thing they do every year. But that's really all they've got going that I'm hearing about, right? They're not very busy right now. They're not passing a big legislative agenda right now. They sound like they were going to with the budget, and now they're doing a small budget. So they're barely paying attention to that. They're barely paying attention to DOGE. Again, Department of Government Efficiency, that's doing a lot of these changes. So Congress, if Trump had gone to Congress, I bet he could have just easily gotten the law changed, and then he wouldn't have run amok of any law. Crow from the future here, or for you, less distant in the past. I realized, as I thought about it, that maybe Trump wouldn't have been able to easily pass these reforms in Congress, or I still think he would, but maybe there would have been some risk of an early legislative loss, which would not have been a great start for his presidency. So I think maybe one of the reasons I didn't see that so quickly is because I do care a lot about the separation of powers issue, and I did not do a great job explaining why I care about that so much. So that might have to be a future discussion about why it matters or doesn't matter and how it affects us if there is strong separation of powers or if it weakens. All right, back to the more distant past. The second potential reason for moving so fast that I could think of is to eliminate potential dissenters or people who would call things into question or just slow walk plans. I'm trying to be a straight shooter here. Again, this podcast, I'm being what I call radically honest, even if I don't like things. So I'll admit that that's a very real possibility, that there would be people working in the federal government who don't like something one president or another is doing, so they kind of slow walk it. I'm not talking about inspector generals here or people seeing wrongdoing, just people not liking things. Sure, that's not impossible. But did the chaos actually cause more inefficiency than we would have seen from just an employee here or there that wasn't gung-ho about a task? I don't know. This might be a legit reason, but you do need to balance it against all the harm that the approach taken has caused. And when balancing the harm versus the possibility that some employees might slow walk some things, which you'd notice anyway because they would suddenly be terrible at their job out of nowhere, well, I kind of feel when you balance that, the sudden mass firings are not great still. The third potential reason for these quick firings is any combination of wanting to make a statement or just seeing federal workers generally as enemies. I'm kind of combining those because it's hard to separate them. I do think Trump has a tendency to kind of view the world in terms of allies and enemies. Like, it's a zero-sum view of the world where usually to benefit someone, you have to screw someone else. Not always. He does not always do that. But he does it a lot more than I'd like. And I don't want to pretend that Democrats haven't done that pretty consistently too. I'd say they've done it a lot less in the past few years, depending which one you're listening to. But they've really made an effort in the past few years. But before that, yeah. I mean, welcome to the two-party system, folks. It's not great. We're actually going to have an upcoming episode. All of us, if you want to pitch in, will have a episode soon about problems with the two-party system and maybe what can be done. Anyway, back to our point here. Again, reason number 3, either making a statement or just viewing people as the enemy. This is less of a logical reason, more emotional. Firing all these federal workers is, 1, a big action that gives big headlines and lets people use words like powerful, decisive, strong. And 2, it's an action against the perceived enemy. You can also say that you cut a branch of spending on those employment salaries before they later hire some of them back, I guess. So, it's also a talking point. Man, I really hope that this is not a major reason that this happened because it's just so dumb. To be clear, I don't think that making a big statement is the main reason that this happened, at least a public statement. But even if it is not the reason, it's still realistic enough that I'm worried it's a reason and I felt I had to include it. All right, potential reason number 4. There's this tech, Silicon Valley mentality that you need to burn something down before you can rebuild it. We've all heard it, though it
is a little different when referring to services we need to keep running daily versus those we do not, right? Like burning down some stalling research efforts and restarting is very different from burning down something that's protecting me from having my identity stolen tomorrow. I'd rather keep that one in place while we're rebuilding. I guess there's a bonus reason, number 5, which is just that they really thought all these jobs were so useless that this really was the best approach, and even with the chaos, nothing was lost. But again, if you hampered a department to the point that it can't really function, you get into that separation of powers issue, you want to be transparent about it. But more importantly, that also means that they did not realize that some of these were so important that they're now trying to hire people back. So if the reason really was that they were just so convinced everyone they were firing was completely useless, they kind of dropped the ball on that one, because they're now trying to hire them back. A few of them. So if they thought the only way to get anything done was to fire everyone and then figure out what was lost, yeah, I can kind of see that because of all the actual inefficiencies and burdensome systems I'm sure are in the federal government. But I just have a hard time seeing that as the reason for all this when they fired the inspector generals first. I feel like I need to keep going back to that. You need those dudes to monitor for corruption. Those are not the first people you fire for something like this. I actually entirely forgot to mention the direct relationship between some of the some of the dramatically impacted agencies and Elon Musk. I'll admit this is not something I've done research about, so I don't want to speak to it as much right now. But I do recall that USAID specifically, which, as you know, is one of the most dramatically impacted places by the firings, USAID specifically was looking into or investigating some issues with some Elon Musk-owned companies. I don't recall the details. Again, this episode, we're not going into agency by agency what they do, other than the inspector generals, because I think that is an overarching issue as well as a specific issue in some ways. But other than that, we're not doing agency by agency, so I'll leave that conversation for a later time. Just know there is some relationship between some of these departments, at least USAID, investigating Elon Musk companies and then being very impacted by the firings. If you want to follow up and let me know to go deeper into that, we can. So let's say, theoretically, we did have that much bloat in the federal workforce. And hey, we probably do. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. Could we have done a hiring freeze or something like that instead? Look, I don't want to be one of those people that never wants to change anything. So I don't want to argue that suddenly, now that things are actually happening, we shouldn't have restructured the federal workforce, whatever. But could we have done essentially a hiring freeze where we say, when an employee leaves, if we don't think they're essential, then we don't hire someone to fill their place once they're gone? If that wasn't enough, then could you also do some staggered reshuffling and firing, and at least employees would have a little more time to see it coming, and you wouldn't have these 62,000 new people suddenly hitting the economy, unemployed, and you'd give these departments time to transition everything over, neatly put things in a way that will remember anything we needed to remember. So you're not Billy the intern trying to figure out why Rob, who was here for 7 years, has a spreadsheet called DF123 outputs, and you have no idea what DF123 stands for because everyone who would know was fired at the exact same time. You could still get all this done within 6 months. You get the point. Even if we accept the premise that they needed to get rid of a lot of employees, that seems like a pretty bad way to have done it. But let me know what you think. Let's say, 1, do you think this was legit? Do you think there actually is a reason to reduce the federal workforce this much? And regardless of whether you do or you don't, take that premise. How would you have done it? Let's say you had about 100,000 employees you wanted to get rid of within 9 months. How would you do it? What would be the way to do it? So there's a lot more to say on this topic, but help guide the conversation. Chip in on anything you want to add on anything we've talked about. If you chip in about how much money these layoffs will or won't save,
then we can talk more about that. Feel free to guide where you want us to go.
Thank you so much for listening. Again, if you want to send in an email or a voice memo, you can attach that to an email to AmericanPublicDiscourse@gmail.com. This is episode 1. I have never done this before, so I'm not bringing over any sort of audience. So I'm starting from zero. Chances are, if you send in something, it'll get my attention. I don't have a lot of people right now I need to divide the attention between. You'll be one of the first. Also, don't be surprised if no one sends in anything. This is episode 1. Again, no audience yet. So if you're listening to this in the future and you want to loop back to something we talked about, feel free to send something in. I'm happy to bring up an issue even after I'm done the main sort of series on it. Also, that email address will be in the description, either YouTube, Spotify. If I get this to Apple Podcasts, it'll be there too. And feel free to guide this podcast toward other topics you want discussed. Again, I need listeners right now, so chances are if you send me something, I will pay attention. All right, it's going to be harder than ever not to be weakened, isolated, and ignorant. The algorithms push us toward our little isolated bubbles. So stay connected and stay informed. Don't let the world isolate us.